Okay, there is no one in chat right now because I started it before sending a link. So if you're watching this in the future, I'm sorry, but the first minute or so is going to be really boring. Da, 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 da. Oh, there's two people here. Huh, that's pretty cool. Yes, I'm back. I'm back with the big book of childhood trauma. Should probably wait for like a couple minutes. But yeah, it would be pretty good to edit Lovecraft stories so that, you know, all the disturbing racist stuff is just kind of directed at groups that deserve it, like Nazis and real life Nazis, like from the olden time, from when they were Hitler Nazis. I don't sleep well. Hey, we got a second person in the chat. I like this. It's like book club, except the only person who gets to actually talk about what they think is me. So it's really the most ideal format. I would like to do something longer, but maybe I could do it in a two-parter or something. I got 3 people in the chat. Who's ready to start? We ready? Look up how long Carmilla is. It is a novella of 108 pages. Oh, okay. Yeah. Nah. Hey, Samuel Hyde, the fellow who wants to know if I'm addicted to ketamine and now says I should have a husband and kids. Yeah, that's true. I'd be so much prettier if I smiled more. But sadly, very tragically, I am actually 34 years old. So, according to Red Pill rules and biology, biotruths, I did hit the wall sometime. What's the age they usually say the wall is beyond which a woman is no longer desirable? Like 15? Yeah, so I hit the wall at like 15, and after that, yeah, I'm really not marriage material anymore. I'm extremely old. Uh, I'm not a virgin, so like, you know, I'm pretty much like used up. It's true. These guys don't want anybody older than they don't want anyone too old because they may have heard what good sex is like, and they don't want anyone young who has had sex with anyone else before because they don't want you to know that what they do is not normal or good. Oh yeah, yeah. No, you can't be funnier than your husband. That is ridiculous. Um, so I really fear that if I were ever to get married by some kind of, you know, beta cuck, um, who sweeps up the used up Stacys, um, that he would be funnier than me and just pretty much overshadow me. That would be terrible. Okay, we've talked incels. That was too scary. So now I'm going to read a nice wholesome story about a children's party from the Big Book of Childhood Trauma. This is The End of the Party by Greene. Peter Morton woke with a start to face the first light. Through the window he could see a bare bough dripping across a frame of silver. Rain tapped against the glass. It was January the 5th. He looked across a table on which a nightlight had guttered into a pool of water at the other bed. Francis Morton was still asleep, and Peter lay down again with his eyes on his brother. It amused him to imagine that it was himself whom he watched. The same hair, the same eyes, the same lips and line of cheek. But the thought soon palled, and his mind went back to the fact which lent the day importance. It was the 5th of January. He could hardly believe that a year had passed since Mrs. Henna Falcon had given her last children's party. Francis turned suddenly upon his back and threw an arm across his face, blocking his mouth. Peter's heart began to beat fast, not with pleasure now, but with uneasiness. He sat up and called across the table, "Wake up!" Francis's shoulders shook, and he waved a clenched fist in the air, but his eyes remained closed. To Peter Morton, the whole room seemed suddenly to darken, and he had the impression of a great bird swooping. He cried again, "Wake up!" And once more there was silver light and the touch of rain on the windows. Francis rubbed his eyes. "Did you call out?" he asked. "You are having a bad dream," Peter said with confidence. Already experience had taught him how far their minds reflected each other. But he was the elder by a matter of minutes, and that brief extra interval of light, while his brother still struggled in pain and darkness, had given him self-reliance and an instinct of protection towards the other who was afraid of so many things. "I dreamed that I was dead," Francis said. "What was it like?" Peter asked with curiosity. "I can't remember," Francis said, and his eyes turned with relief to the silver of day as he allowed the fragmentary memories to fade. "You dreamed of a big bird." "Did I?" Francis accepted his brother's knowledge without question, and for a little the two lay silent in bed facing each other, the same green eyes, the same nose tilting at the tip, the same firm lips parted, and the same premature modelling of the chin. The 5th of January, Peter thought again, his mind drifting idly from the image of cakes to the prizes which might be won. Egg and spoon races, spearing apples in basins of water, blind man's buff. "I don't want to go," Francis said suddenly. "I suppose Joyce will be there, and Mabel Warren." Hateful to him, the thought of a party shared with those two. They were older than he. Joyce was 11, and Mabel Warren 13. Their long pigtails swung superciliously to a masculine stride. Their sex humiliated him as they watched him fumble with his egg from under lowered, scornful lids. And last year, he turned his face away from Peter, his cheeks scarlet. "What's the matter?" Peter asked. "Oh, nothing. I don't think I'm well. I've got a cold. I oughtn't to go to the party." Peter was puzzled. "But Francis, is it a bad cold?" "It will be a bad cold if I go to the party. Perhaps I shall die." "Then you mustn't go," Peter said with decision, prepared to solve all difficulties with one plain sentence, and Francis let his nerves relax in a delicious relief, ready to leave everything to Peter. But though he was grateful, he did not turn his face towards his brother. His cheeks still bore the badge of a shameful memory, of the game of hide-and-seek last year in the darkened house, and of how he had screamed when Mabel Warren put her hand suddenly upon his arm. He had not heard her coming. Girls were like that. Their shoes never squeaked. No boards whined under their tread. They slunk like cats on padded claws. When their nurse came in with hot water, Francis lay tranquil, leaving everything to Peter. Peter said, "Nurse, Francis has got a cold." The tall, starched woman laid the towels across the cans and said, without turning, "The washing won't be back till tomorrow. You must lend him some of your handkerchiefs." "But nurse," Peter asked, "hadn't he better stay in bed?" "We'll take him for a good long walk this morning," the nurse said. "Wind'll blow away the germs. Get up now, both of you." And she closed the door behind her. "I'm sorry," Peter said, and then, worried at the sight of her face, creased again by misery and foreboding, Why don't you just stay in bed? I'll tell Mother you felt too ill to get up. But such a rebellion against destiny was not in Francis's power. Besides, if he stayed in bed, they would come up and tap his chest and put a thermometer in his mouth and look at his tongue, and they would discover that he was malingering. It was true that he felt ill, a sick, empty sensation in his stomach, and a rapidly beating heart, but he knew that the cause was only fear. Fear of the party, fear of being made to hide by himself in the dark, unaccompanied by Peter, and with no nightlight to make a blessed breach. No, I'll get up, he said, and then with sudden desperation, but I won't go to Mrs. Henfalcon's party. I swear on the Bible I won't. Now surely all would be well, he thought. God would not allow him to break so solemn an oath. He would show him a way. There was all the morning before him, and all the afternoon until 4 o'clock. No need to worry now, while the grass was still crisp with the early frost. Anything might happen. He might cut himself, or break his leg, or really catch a bad cold. God would manage somehow. He had such confidence in God that when at breakfast his mother said, "I hear you have a cold, Francis," he made light of it. "We should have heard more about it," his mother said with irony, "if there were not a party this evening." And Francis smiled uneasily, amazed and daunted by her ignorance of him. His happiness would have lasted longer if, out for a walk that morning, he had not met Joyce. He was alone with his nurse, for Peter had to leave to finish a rabbit hutch in the woodshed. If Peter had been there, he would have cared less. The nurse was Peter's nurse also. But now it was as though she was employed only for his sake, because he could not be trusted to go for a walk alone. Joyce was only 2 years older, and she was by herself. She came striding towards them, pigtails flapping. She glanced scornfully at Francis and spoke with ostentation to the nurse. "Hello, nurse. Are you bringing Francis to the party this evening? Mabel and I are coming." And she was off again down the street in the direction of Mabel Warren's house, consciously alone and self-sufficient in the long, empty road. "Such a nice girl," the nurse said. But Francis was silent, feeling again the jump of his heart, realizing how soon the hour of the party would arrive. God had done nothing for him, and the minutes flew. They flew too quickly to plan any evasion, or even to prepare his heart for the coming ordeal. Panic nearly overcame him. Yeah, but he's a little boy. I mean, he's doing his best. He doesn't know he has anxiety. Panic nearly overcame him when, all unready, he found himself standing on the doorstep, with coat collar turned up against a cold wind, and the nurse's electric torch making a short, luminous trail through the darkness. Behind him were the lights of the hall and the sound of a servant laying the table for dinner, which his mother and father would eat alone. He was nearly overcome by a desire to run back into the house and call out to his mother that he would not go to the party, that he dared not go. They could not make him go. He could almost hear himself saying those final words, breaking down forever, as he knew instinctively, the barrier of ignorance that saved his mind from his parents' knowledge. "I'm afraid of going. I won't go. I daren't go. They'll make me hide in the dark, and I'm afraid of the dark. I'll scream and scream and scream." He could see the expression of amazement on his mother's face, and then the cold confidence of a grown-up's retort. "Don't be silly. You must go. We've accepted Mrs. Henfalcon's invitation." But they couldn't make him go. Hesitating on the doorstep while the nurse's feet crunched across the frost-covered grass to the gate, he knew that. He would answer, "You can say I'm ill. I won't go. I'm afraid of the dark." And his mother, "Don't be silly. You know there's nothing to be afraid of in the dark." But he knew the falsity of that reasoning. He knew how they taught also that there was nothing to fear in death, and how fearfully they avoided the idea of it. But they couldn't make him go to the party. "I'll scream. I'll scream." "Francis, come along." He heard the nurse's voice across the dimly phosphorescent lawn, and saw the small yellow circle of her torch wheel from tree to shrub and back to tree again. I'm coming, he called with despair, leaving the lighted doorway of the house. He couldn't bring himself to lay bare his last secrets and end reserve between his mother and himself, for there was still in the last resort a further appeal possible to Mrs. Henna Falcon. He comforted himself with that as he advanced steadily across the hall, very small, towards her enormous bulk. His heart beat unevenly, but he had control now over his voice as he said with meticulous accent, "Good evening, Mrs. Henna Falcon. It was very good of you to ask me to your party." With his strained face lifted towards the curve of her breast, and his polite, set speech, he was like an old withered man. For Francis mixed very little with other children. As a twin, he was in many ways an only child. To address Peter was to speak to his own image in a mirror a little altered by a flaw in the glass, so as to throw back less a likeness of what he was than of what he wished to be, what he would be without his unreasoning fear of darkness, footsteps of strangers, the flight of bats and dusk-filled gardens. "Sweet child," said Mrs. Henna Falcon absent-mindedly, before, with a wave of her arms, as though the children were a flock of chickens, she whirled them into her set programme of entertainments. Egg and spoon races, three-legged races, spearing of apples, games which held for Francis nothing worse than humiliation. And in the frequent intervals when nothing was required of him, and he could stand alone in corners as far removed as possible from Mabel Warren's scornful gaze, he was able to plan how he might avoid the approaching terror of the dark. He knew there was nothing to fear until after tea, and not until he was sitting down in a pool of yellow radiance cast by the 10 candles on Colin Henna Falcon's birthday cake did he become fully conscious of the imminence of what he feared. Through the confusion of his brain, now assailed suddenly by a dozen contradictory plans, he heard Joyce's high voice on the table. "After tea, we are going to play hide and seek in the dark." "Oh, no," Peter said, watching Francis's troubled face with pity and an imperfect understanding. "Don't let's. We play that every year." "But it's in the programme," cried Mabel Warren. "I saw it myself. I looked over Mrs. Henna Falcon's shoulder. 5 o'clock, tea. 5:15 to 6:30, hide and seek in the dark. It's all written down in the programme." Peter did not argue, for if hide and seek had been inserted in Mrs. Henna Falcon's programme, nothing which he could say could avert it. He asked for another piece of birthday cake and sipped his tea slowly. Perhaps it might be possible to delay the game for a quarter of an hour, allow Francis at least a few extra minutes to form a plan. But even in that Peter failed, for children were already leaving the table in twos and threes. It was his third failure, and again the reflection of an image in another's mind. He saw a great bird darken his brother's face with its wings. But he upbraided himself silently for his folly, and finished his cake, encouraged by the memory of that adult refrain, "There's nothing to fear in the dark." The last to leave the table, the brothers came together in the hall to meet the mustering and impatient eyes of Mrs. Henna Falcon. "And now," she said, "we will play hide and seek in the dark." Peter watched his brother and saw, as he had expected, the lips tighten. Francis, he knew, had feared this moment from the beginning of the party, had tried to meet it with courage, and had abandoned the attempt. He must have prayed desperately for cunning to evade the game, which was now welcomed with cries of excitement by all the other children. "Oh, do let's. We must pick sides. Is any of the house out of bounds? Where shall home be?" "I think," said Francis Morton, approaching Mrs. Henna Falcon, his eyes focused unwaveringly on her exuberant breasts, "it will be no use my playing. My nurse will be calling for me very soon." "Oh, but your nurse can wait, Francis," said Mrs. Henna Falcon absent-mindedly, while she clapped her hands together to summon to her side a few children who were already straying up the wide staircase to upper floors. "Your mother will never mind." It's the frequent mention of breasts is not like sexual at all. It's just, meant to give you flashbacks to when you were a little kid and you couldn't really see all the way up there. So sometimes an adult was just a terrifying pair of glasses on a chain, because that was most of what you could see of them. That had been the limit of Francis's cunning. He had refused to believe that so well prepared an excuse could fail. All he could say now, still in the precise tone which other children hated, thinking it a symbol of conceit, was, "I think I had better not play." He stood motionless, retaining, though afraid, unmoved features. But the knowledge of his terror, or the reflection of the terror itself, reached his brother's brain. For the moment, Peter Morton could have cried aloud with the fear of bright lights going out, leaving him alone in an island of dark surrounded by the gentle lapping of strange footsteps. Then he remembered that the fear was not his own, but his brother's. He said impulsively to Mrs. Henner Falcon, "Please, I don't think Francis should play. The dark makes him jump so." They were the wrong words. 6 children began to sing "Cowardy, Cowardy Custard," turning torturing faces with the vacancy of wide sunflowers towards Francis Morton. We're getting some bullying flashbacks, guys. Got some flashbacks going in the chat. Seriously, fucking kids. I'm so glad I'm not one. Without looking at his brother, Francis said, "Of course I'll play. I'm not afraid. I only thought." But he was already forgotten by his human tormentors, and was able in loneliness to contemplate the approach of the spiritual, the more unbounded torture. The children scrambled around Mrs. Henner Falcon, their shrill voices pecking at her with questions and suggestions. "Yes, anywhere in the house. We will turn out all the lights. Yes, you can hide in the cupboards. You must stay hidden as long as you can. There will be no home." Peter, too, stood apart, ashamed of the clumsy manner in which he had tried to help his brother. Now he could feel, creeping in at the corners of his brain, all Francis's resentment of his championing. Several children ran upstairs, and the lights on the top floor went out. Then darkness came down like the wings of a bat and settled on the landing. Others began to put the lights out at the edge of the hall, till the children were all gathered in the central radiance of the chandelier, while the bats squatted round on hooded wings and waited for that too to be extinguished. Well, that question is going to be answered very soon. I have this refreshing sip of Diet Coke. It's kind of warm now. "You and Francis are on the hiding side," a tall girl said. Mrs. Henner Falcon has already made the teams, I assume, just based on what we've seen so far. You and Francis are on the hiding side," a tall girl said, and then the light was gone, and the carpet wavered under his feet with the sibilance of footfalls, like small cold draughts creeping away into corners. "Where's Francis?" he wondered. "If I join him, he'll be less frightened of all these sounds." These sounds were the casing of silence, the squeak of a loose board, the cautious closing of a cupboard door, the whine of a finger drawn along polished wood. Peter stood in the centre of the dark, deserted floor, not listening, but waiting for the idea of his brother's whereabouts to enter his brain. But Francis crouched with fingers on his ears, eyes uselessly closed, mind numbed against impressions, and only a sense of strain could cross the gap of dark. Then a voice called, "Coming!" And as though his brother's self-possession had been shattered by the sudden cry, Peter Morton jumped with his fear. But it was not his own fear. What in his brother was a burning panic, admitting no ideas except those which added to the flame, was in him an altruistic emotion that left the reason unimpaired. Where, if I were Francis, should I hide? Such, roughly, was his thought. And because he was, if not Francis himself, at least a mirror to him, the answer was immediate. Between the oak bookcase on the left of the study door and the leather settee. Peter Morton was unsurprised by the swiftness of the response. Between the twins there could be no jargon of telepathy. They had been together in the womb, and they could not be parted. Peter Morton tiptoed towards Francis's hiding place. Occasionally a ball rattled, and because he feared to be caught by one of the soft questers through the dark, he bent and untied his laces. A tag struck the floor, and the metallic sound sent a host of cautious feet moving in his direction. but by that time he was in his stockings and would have laughed inwardly at the pursuit had not the noise of someone stumbling on his abandoned shoes made his heart trip in the reflection of another's surprise. No more boards revealed Peter Morton's progress. On stockinged feet, he moved silently and unerringly towards his object. Instinct told him that he was near the wall, and extending a hand, he laid his fingers across his brother's face. Francis did not cry out, but the leap of his own heart revealed to Peter a proportion of Francis's terror. "It's all right," he whispered, feeling down the squatting finger until he captured a clenched hand. "It's only me. I'll stay with you." And grasping the other tightly, he listened to the cascade of whispers his utterance had caused to fall. A hand touched the bookcase close to Peter's head, and he was aware how Francis's fear continued, in spite of his presence. It was less intense, more bearable, he hoped, but it remained. He knew that it was his brother's fear, and not his own, that he experienced. The dark to him was only an absence of light, the groping hand that of a familiar child. Patiently he waited to be found. He did not speak again, for between Francis and himself touch was the most intimate communion. By way of joined hands, thought could flow more swiftly than lips could shape themselves around words. He could experience the whole progress of his brother's emotion, from the leap of panic at the unexpected contact to the steady pulse of fear, which now went on and on with the regularity of a heartbeat. Peter Morton thought with intensity, "I am here. You needn't be afraid. The lights will go on again soon. That rustle, that movement is nothing to fear. Only Joyce. Only Mabel Warren." He bombarded the drooping form with thoughts of safety, but he was conscious that the fear continued. "They are beginning to whisper together. They are tired of looking for us. The lights will go on soon. We shall have won. Don't be afraid. That was only someone on the stairs. I believe it's Mrs. Hen Falcon. Listen. They're feeling for the lights." Feet moving on a carpet, hands brushing a wall, a curtain pulled apart, a clicking handle, the opening of a cupboard door. In the case above their heads, a loose book shifted under a touch. Only Joyce. Only Mabel Warren. Only Mrs. Hen Falcon. A crescendo of reassuring thought before the chandelier burst like a fruit tree into bloom. The voices of the children rose shrilly into the radiance. "Where's Peter? Have you looked upstairs? Where's Francis?" But they were silenced again by Mrs. Hen Falcon's scream. But she was not the first to notice Francis Morton's stillness, where he had collapsed against the wall at the touch of his brother's hand. Peter continued to hold the clenched fingers in an arid and puzzled grief. It was not really merely that his brother was dead. His brain, too young to realize the full paradox, yet wondered with an obscure self-pity why it was that the pulse of his brother's fear went on and on, when Francis was now where he had been always told that there was no more terror and no more darkness. The end. So, yep, that one definitely stuck with me as a child. For obvious reasons. Not just being bullied by other kids, but all that anxiety and the fact that adults don't listen. And time just ticks on, and that horrible thing that you're dreading is going to happen because, a very bossy grown-up has decided that it will be so, and so it will be. You just kind of give yourself up into fate. Exactly. Well, my parents didn't because they were a little bit different. My dad told me that I should be the most frightening thing in the dark. So, yeah, there is something frightening in the dark. It's me. So, watch out, everything. I had a different upbringing. But Yeah, and of course the ending definitely stuck with me, and the horrible, horrible irony that that while he's trying to help his brother, Peter is the one that gives him the terrible fright that makes his heart stop. It's just horrible. Yeah, it is a much better approach, but I'm actually not the worst thing in the dark. I found that out once when I stepped on a slug unexpectedly. That was the worst thing. That was horrible. Oh, I was in bare feet. I don't like to talk about it, actually. So apart from as long as you got your shoes on, you can be the most frightening thing in the dark. But yeah, the proof that after death it is still scary as fuck. That's a story to stick with you. Um, so yes, thank you everyone who is watching now. Thank you everyone who will watch in the future when I become extremely famous for probably inventing a new way to fall over or something equally embarrassing. Um, but yes, thank you. That was Greene, The End of the Party. And it's our second story about a children's party. And tomorrow, I do not know what I will pick. Yeah, thanks everybody. That was really fun, and I will see you tomorrow. Like and subscribe to Win Minivan.